St. Paul A.M.E. here in Santa Barbara, what it represents in terms of the Black community, and, obviously the landmark status that was established last year. Congratulations for that, by the way.
Thank you. Since we had talked about the designation of St. Paul as a historic landmark in the city, I do think that it would not be fair for us to acknowledge the broad cross-section of folks who came together to complete that designation. It started out years ago. The landmark designation started out 20-something years ago, and for whatever reason, it kind of languished. And due to incidents like the George Floyd incident in Minnesota, the Black Lives Matter movement, and those folks in the Santa Barbara area who are affiliated with that, I believe put enough significant inertia and pressure on the Santa Barbara city leadership that caused them to re-engage with us on the landmark designation. And once we were re-engaged, and once we got the support of our Episcopal leadership, the Right Reverend Clement W. Few, and our presiding elder, the Reverend Dr. Alan L. Williams, that was a group, and for the most part, they were non-African Americans that jumped in and was vital in helping us pull together all of the information. So while my name was affixed to it, it was certainly a community-based thrust, plus and just talking with the members to pull some of that history together as well. And so when you talk about the significance of it, it certainly was a community project to get that designation. So I was very thankful to those in the Black Lives Matters movement that assisted us, or that reinvigorated the move to get St. Paul designated as a historical landmark. I was certainly thankful to those who came in and helped us put together the package and helped champion the package, and certainly thankful to the membership for their participation in developing the package as well.
What exactly is it about St. Paul's A.M.E. that makes it so special here to the city of Santa Barbara?
It's people. The greatest resources that St. Paul ever had are the people. It isn't defined by the walls that confine the building, but what is within them. And when you think in 1906 that a group of African American came together to purchase a piece of property in the city of Santa Barbara for the whopping sum of $10 in 1906.
Okay.
We scoff at that today, but $10 in 1906 was a huge sum of money for people of African descent to come up with, and they did it, and they purchased it through some donations from some of the members. And it is widely believed that the original construction of the church was done by the members themselves. And when you think of, at least when I reflect on hearing in 1911 that the members held a mass meeting for people of color to address current issues in the Santa Barbara area, I'm inclined to believe that it's the people. And the members of St. Paul have had, their hands in both spiritual and civic endeavors since 1903. There's a gentleman named Jerry Fournier who was um, the records is unclear whether he was a member of St. Paul or not. I don't believe that he was, but his daughter, Dorothy Fournier Wright, was definitely a member of St. Paul and is featured as one of the angels in the mural that sits in the nave of the church. When you start thinking about how the people Jerry Fournier came to Santa Barbara in the 1800s. St. Paul got its foundation in the early December of 1903. You can talk about the influence that the members have had. Sister Young mentioned that for a long time, the president of the NAACP was a member of St. Paul. Um, she didn't mention this, but her husband was the first African American attorney in the city of Santa Barbara. Dr. Horace McMillan was the first medical doctor in the city of Santa Barbara. So when you start talking about what is it that makes Santa Barbara special, and not just those folks who were significant in what they were doing because they were pioneers in the area, it's the everyday occurrence of a multitude of members who put service to mankind very high on the shelf. So as a Johnny come lately to St. Paul, I was just awed at just reading the history of what the people had done in the community. And, the, I saw later on you asked about that legacy. That's the legacy of St. Paul. That it has always had a pulse on what is going on in the community, as well as being a place for spiritual uplifting.
I was born in Shreveport, Louisiana, but I left there at the age of 7, and I lived in Los Angeles, California, until I left for college at UC Santa Barbara in 1970. Um, I lived in Santa Barbara from 1970 until I left in 2004. So, as a student at UCSB, because I was always raised up in a church, one of the first things I did was to try to find a church home. And because I was baptized as a Baptist, I had heard of Second Baptist Church with Reverend Wilkes. Plus, Reverend Wilkes used to, teach a course, a religious studies course at UCSB. So I was kind of familiar with him. So I started going there. And then one of my real close friends that I met in college, she invited me to go to church with her at St. Paul because she and her family were A.M.Es. And at that time, I didn't know the difference between an A.M.E and a Baptist. And the first thing I noticed is that, well, the A.M.E church doesn't last as long as the Baptist church. Maybe I'll join this church.
Okay.
Because I was cognizant of that, because the AME church was letting out at 12:30, and the Baptist church was letting out at 1:30. So I really enjoyed going to church with my friend and her family. So in 1979, that's when I joined St. Paul AME, and I became very active in the church. I joined the Women's Missionary Society. I eventually became a steward. And then at that time, I was married to my first husband. I got a divorce and then I remarried. And I had my first child. And at the time, Reverend Davis, who passed away many, many years ago, he was the pastor when I joined the church in 1979. In fact, my daughter, who is now 39, she was the last child that he baptized before he passed.
But it also seems like it was a cornerstone of Black political growth, Black economic growth, Black educational growth.
Well, at one time, the people in Santa Barbara were very cohesive, and we were cohesive in the sense that we came together and had an NAACP. We had the Black churches, even though each Black church did their own thing regarding the NAACP. In other words, the NAACP president was from St. Paul. We then had Greater Hope. We had the Missionary Baptist Church on Coda. And we had the Lewis Chapel, which was on Gutierrez. And of course, we had St. Paul, which was on Olive and Haley. And I think we should really note that it was a very great location for the people that were, and I'm talking about the people of color that were in Santa Barbara at the time. Now, I came in the 60s. I came in 61. And I stayed here, and we did a number of things within the employment agencies within the Santa Barbara, because the employment agencies did not recognize the people of color, the Black folks, and especially the banks.
My wife has told me that Haley Street was very much an active hub for a lot of activity for the Black community around that time. Like there were several Black-owned businesses.
Oh, you're right. You're absolutely right. I forgot about that. There was a barbershop there and on Haley Street, and then there was I don't believe there was a salon or a hairdresser at the time, but I think he was very active, and I'm talking about the fellow who transitioned on. He was very active in a radio program that they had out of UCSB, and they would bring people into Santa Barbara. When I said they would bring people, I'm talking about they would bring like artists.
My husband, he says that he used to play with the band at the Swing Club. I guess there was a Black club called the Swing Club on Haley.
Okay.
And I remember, they had the Proud Bird chicken. There was another Black restaurant that was on Milka's, I believe. I'm trying to remember the name of it. I'm sorry, my memory is bad. Sally may remember.
It's fine. It's fine.
But they were like coming, the Black businesses, they would like come and go, But from what my husband shared with me back in the 60s, it was pretty jumping on down on Haley Street with the Swing Club and some of the other, there were Black-owned businesses.
Well,
but by the time I got there in 1970, I mean, that wasn't the case. I mean, except other than we had we always had, Connie Connie Hicks, she was a Black beautician.
Got you.
Probably still is. So we had to have a place to get our hair done.
Got you.
But other than that, I can't think of any.
Most of the people from UCSB, which was the college, where we received a lot of students that came in from the LA area, they mostly stayed out in the Goleta area. So we really were interested in getting them to become part of the Santa Barbara community. Now, they did not become part of the Santa Barbara community until we had a pastor who was with St. Paul, who went out and formed a little, I would say, like a fraternity. And in that fraternity, they had several members that participated in the church.
Reverend Wright did so much for St. Paul. In my opinion, he was the one that brought St. Paul to the forefront in terms of going out to UCSB and engaging with students. And then all of a sudden we had all of the students that was coming to church, and it was great. They formed a coalition of people to walk down State Street um, um, protesting because they would never show any black movies on State Street. They were always up at the Riviera or somewhere. And I remember that Reverend Ron Wright, he led that group of people to demanding that they show Boys in the Hood on State Street. So, with having all of the college students at St. Paul, the church was just growing and thriving, and people learned the music because there was the senior choir, there was the youth choir, there was so much going on, and you start feeling a sense of community among the black people. They were really gravitating towards St. Paul. Um, in fact, even some of the other black churches like Second Baptist and Greater Hope, Friendship, some of their members would also, they didn't leave their churches, but they would come to St. Paul for different events.
Now, we also had a scholarship committee, and the scholarship committee was by the lady Wilson, her name was, and she really formed it. And the president of the George Washington Scholarship Committee was Clemente Johnson. And Clemente Johnson was very active in the Greater Hope, no, Second Baptist Church. And she was very much involved in the George Washington Scholarship Committee.
One of the things that I became actively involved in was the George Washington Carver Scholarship Club. I don't know if you've heard of that, but
Yes.
it originated out of St. Paul in 1931. I became a member of that. In fact, I became the president of the organization in 1998, and I was the president until I left in 2004. And so we started having a lot of receptions and events, blues crews, and just doing all kind of things to bring the Black community together. And when you made mention to that, the whole time I was in Santa Barbara as a student, I didn't really feel like there was a sense of a Black community because they were like everywhere. They were in Goleta, they were on the east side around Haley Street. You would mostly find Black people in the churches.
Kennedy, who taught Black studies at UCSB in the 30s and 40s?
She became active in the Santa Barbara community later on in the 60s when she began to organize the community. But Shirley Kennedy was very active out there again. She taught at UCSB, but like so many of the people, and there was also a little fellow named Johnson who was also out there at UCSB, and he taught.
And when Sister Young mentioned the George Washington Carver Club, its original 8 members were all members of St. Paul, and that club had the same zeal to make sure that education was a thing that people of color, African American, could pursue. Not only that they encouraged them with words of encouragement, but also with financial dollars to help them to pursue their educational goals. And I believe it's still functional today, 70 plus years of work. It's grown beyond just the members of St. Paul, but its original 8 members were all members of St. Paul.
Well, I think we should also mention that the Masons were very active.
Absolutely.
And they were members of St. Paul. They claim that they added on to the, which was then the parsonage there on Haley Street, the upstairs. So
in 1906, the original construction of St. Paul was done. As I mentioned earlier, widely believed that that original construction was done by the members, and the city records will bear out it was it was not the same distinctive um, um, construction and Gothic style that you see today. Uh, that current building dates back to 1916, but in 1906, the original building, and then in 1924, somewhere around there, 1924 to 1927. Memory is not quite that good on the dates, but it was somewhere in the 1920s that the Masons came along and added the fellowship hall and the upstairs portion to the church, as well as in the 1920s, the parsonage was developed. So this close-knit relationship between St. Paul's members and the tentacles that they had in various other organizations in the community is why I say St. Paul's most valued resources throughout the years have been its people. And I love to say this, St. Paul sits on the corner of Olive and Haley, uh, close enough to man, but close to God. And that's our zeal. We are to stay close to God, but also close to mankind.
St. Paul was the hub, so to speak, of all of the outgrowth of the other churches, of the other African American churches within Santa Barbara, because the people from African American, as you know, we have a annual conference, and by that time sometimes they change the pastors, and with the pastors, the people all seem to gravitate toward St. Paul. Now, I don't know exactly if the total membership at St. Paul was people coming from the other churches, but I do remember a number of them did come from the other churches within the community.
When I first joined the church, I had Miss Beulah Benjamin, who was my class leader. And what a class leader does is check on you. And so feeling isolated out at the university and to have, you know, I called her Mother Benjamin to call and check on me. And, how are you doing? Why haven't you been at church? I've been thinking about you. It gave me a sense of family away from home. Okay. And then we had Mother Sims, who was there till she passed at 103, and she was always always on us about dressing properly and acting properly. And so you felt like you were a part of a big family, okay? And it was just wonderful to raise my daughters in that environment where they were baptized and taken care of. Um, and those are the fun memories that I have of the elderly people in the church that they became your other moms, your other grandmoms, and you really respect Mr. Barnes. I just Grover Barnes. I know you may have heard of him because he has so much rich history in the church, and just like these are just special people that made it special. The connection with the
Right.
special people, and I mean the gatherings that we had, the down home cooking. It's like um, you just felt really connected. Like you can go to some churches and you're just a person sitting in the congregation. Nobody
Right.
knows you, nobody cares. But at this church, if you missed a Sunday, you're gonna get a phone call to check on you, and that's very uplifting and very encouraging.
It's certainly a testament to the institution that St. Paul's A.M.E. has been able to continue nonstop and maintain its standing within the community.
Well, I think St. Paul, another thing I think we ought to mention, the membership of St. Paul, the majority of them, as they came from the South, they were employed by people in the Montecito area. And that's where I feel that the St. Paul received all the economics capabilities as to adding on to, because a number of the families were employed by people of the other race, which really not only contribute to St. Paul, but really were a great part of monies coming into Santa Barbara, St. Paul.
What sort of services does St. Paul's A.M.E. offer to parishioners and to the community at large?
Well, right now, because of the coronavirus, we're, like most churches, we're broadcasting in some media now. And right now we're broadcasting and we do the service at 10:30, well, 11:30, right after the Sunday school, and we start at 9:30. So at 10:30, we do a service, and it's a full service, but it's done over the internet. So it's done on a platform like this. And we have the sermon, we have everything. We just follow that in Pastor Clark's tradition to continue the service. And then most churches are doing that. We go in, I go in, and he did too, and care after the church also. But we have very few meetings in the church, especially in this, Darrell, in this breakout time. We want to protect our seniors and then everybody really. So they want us to stay out of the church. Some groups are going into the church and creating a service. I hope to do that when the virus lessens some. We did it at another of our sister churches where I came from, Parks Chapel. So you go in and you have the sermon, and then you have the worship service right there, and communion and everything. You have your musician there, but you only have one or two people from the congregation, maybe to do a scripture and things like that. And then you still have to broadcast that out for everybody to see. And I think that when I talk to the congregation, they can't wait for the time when they can get back together. So they love the hugs and then the fellowship, the spirit of koinonia, which is togetherness and fellowship. They miss that. And that's what they tell me all the time when I talk to them.
So historically, Mr. McNeill, just to add on to what Pastor Sherrod was saying, I'm a scientist by training. In my secular career, history was never something that I was fascinated by. But when I began to work with the committee on getting the landmark status, I began to run across tidbits of information that just tweaked my. In 1917, St. Paul became a voter polling place for people of color. And they did it on several different occasions throughout the year. When you start talking about what does it do beyond the ministry. And in recent history, the Nora F. Taylor Women's Missionary Society adopted a battered women's shelter, providing clothing, toiletries, blankets. While I found no definite notations of this, I'm sure over the years that there have been feeding or food programs that address the needs of hunger. So throughout its storied history, St. Paul's been no different than any of the other churches there, looking to address the concerns. As we mentioned, our members have been fully vested in AACP, as well as the George Washington Carver Club and the Masons and many
the
others.
The Afro-American Community Center came about because we had two prominent people within Santa Barbara who contributed and served on served in the Congress, I would say, when I say the Congress, I meant in the congressional part of Santa Barbara, and they were Bill Sims and Valencia Nelson, who were two very strong individuals who really saw to it that the African American community, what we had there at the time when I came in the 60s, was the fact that we had an opportunity to congregate and to meet, a meeting place.
Absolutely, Sister Young. That portion that probably needs to also be well stated, that the property was used on several occasions to serve as a meeting place for people of color to discuss various issues.
It was a culture shock for me. Coming to Santa Barbara was a culture shock for me because it was predominantly white. And so there wasn't a lot of Black students at the university. And so those of us who were there, we kind of aligned ourselves with the Black Student Union. And so that became our support system. So looking out into the community, the first thing that we thought of was a church home, because, for many of us, that was our upbringing.
Right.
Our parents kept saying, you need to get in the church, So as I said before I even had heard of St. Paul, I had heard of Second Baptist Church because of Reverend Wilkes, and then his son played basketball, Jamal Wilkes. But it was only with my friend, and she and I became very close friends, that I was introduced to St. Paul. I think I was introduced to I went to 70. It took a while for me to get to St. Paul. From the time I arrived from 70, I would say around maybe 1978 is when I started going to St. Paul, but I didn't join till 79.
How would you characterize the most pronounced changes in the church, in the community, and the relationship that the church has to the community? How's that changed? How's that evolved?
So since I'm the newer last pastor, I can say that I've talked to quite a few of the congregants, and they're well respected in the community. So that means there was a greater level of respect. People, as you get older, I think you're less out there. But I think that when I go over to Brother Vickers' house and I'm standing outside by his house, everyone that comes along knows him and calls him out by name, because he's 96 years old. So I think that those who are in the community and still in there, they're still recognized. But I still think that in any church, we're seeing that if you don't have young people coming in behind in middle age, you don't get that same effect that our forebears to St. Paul had when they were there fighting with the NAACP, using the NAACP, getting rights, getting voters out. We still do some of that, but I think Brother Darrell, is less feed into that, is less people coming in there. And I think that because young people now are doing their own thing a little more, and that doesn't always mean going over to the church like the old days. Sister Young said that was the meeting place. Now young people is not the meeting place for young people. So that's my part. We got to figure out ways to get them back. I want to get the college students back, whatever races they are. I want to get them back. I want to try to establish a choir with them. They were some of our members and some of theirs. So we know that the older members can teach the younger. So we want to do that, but we got to get through COVID, and we'll be able to do some of that. I'm sure Reverend Clark was doing some of that too. So I'll turn it over to him, and he'll bridge the rest of the gap.
I don't know about bridging the gap, but culturally speaking, the dynamics of the church has certainly changed. You think about 1903, the hub of the community, not just the the hub of the African American community was the church. And this is prominent because one of the things that the founding fathers of the African Methodist Episcopal Church did was they wanted educated folk to serve as pastors, because in most cases they were able to help the congregation with matters outside of just the spiritual realm. And so in the early 1900s, the number of African American people who were educated was significantly behind the curve. You ask about the change, you come to 2021, the numbers are not where I'd certainly hope they would be, but they're certainly significantly different than they were in 1903. The influences of organizations like the NAACP, the Urban League, Black Lives Matters, all of these different avenues that people have to address some civil unrest issues. I don't think it takes away from it, because in many instances, it's still members of the church who are flying their efforts under a different banner.
There was a lot of racism in the dorms, and there was a big segment on it on 60 Minutes. The news media came, and at that time I was working in the Educational Opportunity Program, and we had to sit in on meetings about how we were going to handle the situation. So yeah, there was a lot of racial tension at UCSB, and they had to come to the realization that they couldn't keep covering it up because people was, speaking out about it.
Right.
And they start putting in more changes. They started offering more courses in the Black Studies department. They started requiring that students had to take an ethnic studies course as part of their general education requirements. They started looking more at diversity in terms of applying for jobs, because I was part of that. I was like, I went to all four corners of the campus trying to see, if I can get promoted. And just looking in the, but then by the time I got to the ELP, I felt like I was stuck there. It's like they didn't want me to leave.
Gotcha.
Because I was the head counselor in the Black component of EOP. And
Right.
so that's when I made the decision to go to City College, because there was nowhere else for me to go. I felt boxed in. Okay, so that was that element too. But some positive things came out of it. I mean, we worked with the sororities, in the fraternities, and 100 Black men. They had the Conte. I was the first advisor for a group of women, the Conte, because they did not want to be identified with the sororities, but they formed a Black women's group. And then we had, I started a program of mentorship, big brother, big sister kind of thing, and a mentorship where a Black faculty or staff person was paired with a Black female student. So we did a lot of things to make people feel like they had a sense of support. And I think, I'll be honest, the only reason I left UCSB was because I refused to be stereotyped or stuck. I was a person on the move, okay?
Yeah.
And I felt like I had enough experience that I needed to be promoted to a higher position, and they wanted me to stay as the senior counselor in the Black component of ELP and wouldn't allow me to move up. So that's why I moved out and went to Santa Barbara City College.
You had come in at a time when the city of Santa Barbara was kind of primed for change, really, in a larger
Mhm.
way than it had been previously, as far as the Black community making a real presence here in the city.
Mhm.
Um,
That's true. There was, uh, a real good outreach effort to diversify the campus. In fact, the Black Alumni Association was really active in working with the chancellor and assistant chancellors and different departments to bring in more Black students um, from different high schools and also community colleges. And the Black Alumni Association was very, very active and tied to the campus to do that. The other thing that I want to say is that because life at the university was kind of isolated, there was no connection between what went on at the university out in Goleta and the Santa Barbara community itself. You know, it's like there was no connection there. And the whole effort was to bring the two together so that there was more of a sense of community.
Right.
Because everybody was so isolated. You know, everybody was just, you know, if you were a student at UCSB, you stayed at UCSB or you go to Isla Vista, but you didn't really go into Santa Barbara. You would just like go back to LA or go home on the weekend. And even with the students at Santa Barbara City College, there was no real interaction with them with the university, but they were more closely in line with the community because of the things that went on. So it took a lot of years for there to be some kind of coordination to bring things together. And as I said, I give a lot of credit to Reverend Ron Wright. I mean, he's deceased now. He was a younger minister. He went out to the university and he brought students to the church.
Good.
And to me, I think that that was the beginning. That was the beginning because students brought students in.
The foundation of the African Methodist Episcopal Church itself promotes education, and in those very necessary times in the early if you go back to the 1700s, it was very much more pronounced that you had folks who were educated, in many sense that they may have been the only people in the congregation who could read. They may have been the only ones in the congregation who could understand how to navigate some of the things. And so I guess the point I was trying to make, that as we have progressed into 2021, that tendency to lean that heavily for that aspect of dealing with civil issues have kind of been diluted from the church. But again, I'm constantly reminded that even though those other banners are flying, it's still members of the church who are supporting those efforts. And without a doubt, I don't believe you can address some of the civil unrest issues without some spiritual foundation. And that's the hallmark purpose of the church, is to get people rooted and grounded in, I wouldn't be worth my salt if I would not confess that a faith relationship with Jesus Christ is what gets us through a multitude of our issues. And you build them. And I was reminded of something not too long ago, a sermon preached by the Right Reverend T. Larry Kirkland at an annual conference. The A.M.E. Church was looking for people with competent minds, but compassionate hearts. And that's the cornerstone of what we try to represent in A.M.E. Church. You have to have something to give the people, both spiritually as well as the things that will help them do. And while that's not the primary focus, or it's never was the primary focus, the church is not heavily relied on in civil matters as much as it used to be, but it's still the cornerstone for spiritual support. So in that sense, not a whole lot has changed, but in the civil side, significant changes.
How would you characterize the fellowship of the A.M.E churches, the network along the Central Coast, is there is there like is there like a fair amount of fellowship and mutual cooperation between the churches in that network?
Well, won't I start? Won't I start and you come in because you're gonna show me up anyhow. So let me go ahead and tell them this. There is Brother Darrell, because uh, where I came from, there's two gentlemen that are very close to me. I've known them for 30 something years, and I followed them to St. Paul. So that is Reverend Clark and Reverend Ford. Where I just came from, Reverend Ford is the pastor of St. Chapel, Park Chapel, right? St. Paul's Chapel. Yeah. So what I'm saying is the Central Coast. When I'm giving you this is information on how the church works. For the Central Coast, which is all the way from Port Magoo, all the way up past Lompoc, all the way up almost to San Francisco. When one of the 2 or 3 churches that come open there, okay, usually someone who lives close in the area is going to get to church. So Reverend Clark was from Oxnard. Reverend Ford lived in Camarillo. I lived in Oxnard. Now I live in the valley. So what I'm saying is, you know the people, and so I know them very closely. I've known them for 30 something years, and so we have a sisterhood between the churches: Parks Chapel, St. Paul, Bethel, and then I think that you may be surprised of who, our pastor at Parks Chapel, probably pastors have to retire at a certain point, may be a person that we know take his place. So what I'm saying, they're tied by the people, the ministers, and then someone might leave St. Paul and go to Bethel. So it's a close-knit family in the Central Coast, and we're satellite churches. And if you're a satellite church off the beaten path of LA, you got to get to know everybody. Reverend Clark told me about one time a prominent minister out of LA came to visit him. And when he got there, first thing he said, that was a long haul to get there. So I think that these churches, in the church in Oxnard, Bethel, St. Paul, and Parks Chapel share a sisterhood, and we know each other, and we need to do more together. But I'm saying that we all are kind of fitting in there, and we fit in with the churches in the LA too.
Within the realm of the African Methodist Episcopal Church, we use the term connectional, and what that is, we use the term connectional church, and what that really what that really conveys is that we are organized into Episcopal district, and Mr. McNeill, you and I were talking about this a little bit earlier. We're organized into Episcopal districts, and within each Episcopal district, we're organized into annual conferences, and within each annual conference, we're organized into districts. So there is that familiarity, there is that fellowship that exists because we are connectional. Annually, we have a district conference where all of the churches in the district come together. Then you go up a level to the annual conferences, and all of the churches in that conference come together. So California is situated where there are 2 annual conferences. There's the California Conference, which includes churches north of Santa Maria all the way up to the state line, and the Southern California Conference, which includes Santa Maria and everything south down to the southern portion of the church. And so where St. Paul sits is, I almost said we, sorry about that, Pastor Sherrod. The way St. Paul sits in it is we're part of the 5th Episcopal District of the Southern California Annual Conference, and of the Los Angeles North District. So that connection there keeps us together. But just think about this: the two churches, the one in Santa Maria and the one in Lompoc, were both started by members who used to be at St. Paul. When you think about the church in Oxnard, it was certainly supported and helped in its development by the members of St. Paul. And Pastor Sherrod has already talked about Parks Chapel and Pacoima, and I mentioned to you about Santa Monica. So Reverend Reuben Ford, he used to be the pastor of St. Paul, also pastored both Parks Chapel, which he's currently at now, but before there, he was at the church in Santa Monica. So there's lots of connections. So Pastor Sherrod, Pastor Ford, and myself all came out of the Oxnard Church, and I was at Lompoc for the first stint. So there's a lot of connectivity, and we have had joint services. I shared with Mr. McNeill that Pastor Ford in his tenure had invited me several times up when I was the pastor of Providence First A.M.E Church in Lompoc, and we've had reciprocal relationships over the years.
Hey, Brother Darrell, let me just quickly tail on to what Reverend Clark said. I would be remiss if I didn't say that God has been really good to the A.M.E Church. Around the 50s and 60s, it became strong in what we call liberation theology. So James Caan and a lot of others started embracing the fact that people still had to be liberated. And if you go back, Reverend Clark, and you go back to the time when the Israelites were in Egypt, God practiced liberation theology. God freed them from the Egyptians. And I'm saying that so a lot of the ecumenical churches and the churches that are predominantly white don't necessarily understand the liberation theology because they're not needing to be freed from something. So we are Christians, so we teach out of the Bible, but the Bible is full of liberation theology because all the time in the promised land, somebody was oppressing someone else. And God's prophets preached against oppressing people. And so it's prominent in his word. God doesn't want people oppressing other people. So I'm saying that we as mainly as African-American people still have to be liberated from the society around us because they are oppressing us daily. And so that's one of the strong things Sister Young talked about, and Brother Reverend Clark, the community, the Black community had to stick together to be liberated together. They couldn't, these separate groups wouldn't work that well. But when they saw that the Black people were together, then they created a strong force that this northern state had to take, a note of. So liberation theology is in the Bible, and is something that God blessed the A.M.E Church with, to be a voice to liberate people all around the world. And as Sister Young said, H.M. Turner was one of the first to go to Africa and taught and preached and learned from the people in Africa. I'll turn it back over to you.
Well, I don't know how familiar you are, Mr. McNeill, with the history and the foundation of the African Methodist Episcopal Church. In the 1700s, Richard Allen and several other folks were at St. George Methodist Episcopal Church, and they were asked to get up from the altar praying, and then to make room for some Caucasian members. They were reserved to the balconies. And it was out of that confrontation that Richard Allen and Absalom Jones and others started the Free African Society, which later became the African Methodist Episcopal Church. And I get this question all the time: well, why do you call yourselves African Methodist Episcopal? And We had to learn this very early in African, because it was started by people of African descent. Methodist is because we came out of the Methodist Episcopal Church, and Episcopal simply means that we have bishops at the lead. But one of the cornerstone statements of the A.M.E. Church has always been, while we were founded by people of color, we were never constructed to be just people of color. We wanted to make sure that people, Richard Allen and Absalom Jones and the other founders wanted to make sure that people of color were free to worship God in their true sense. And so when you run across non-African American people, they say, well, why do you say African? Because our rich tradition is that we wanted to be noted that we were started by people of African descent.
Let's talk specifically about this past year with regard to the pandemic and the Black Lives Matter movement and George Floyd. How has this particular year impacted the church?
Well, I'll start then. I think it has decimated the church as far as going into a building. But we know that the church is not a building. The church, as Reverend Clark said, are the people. So we take the church with us so we can still be emissaries of God. And that's what we have to be because Brother Darrell, more so than ever, the society, I don't know, you know how it got that way because of the suffering. I think Black people in America have suffered more than just about any other people around the world in the last 300-400 years. So people almost see you, and you can say if you agree, when you're in New York or when you're back east, people see you as almost like priests. People in trouble, they'll come to you, ask you to pray for them. When they see an African-American person, they feel that you're closely connected with suffering, and so you'll know how to deal with them and how to help them. So we are the church, and we take ourselves around when we go out, we take ourselves out, but it has been tougher. But I think it's a time where people are calling on Black people, and then the races are bonding. Those who want to bond and want to understand what we are feeling are coming closer to us. And I know Reverend Clark and all of you, everyone on here, already share a tight knit with Caucasian people because that's who's around us. And we're loving people, so we're gonna love who's around us. I don't run away from Caucasian people. I'll be running away from 70-something% of the people around. So what I'm saying, I have wonderful Caucasian friends, Hispanic friends, but I keep my Blackness because that's what I am. Now I'm a child of Blackness, child of African, heritage. So we're finding, and I know you found that, everybody on this call has found that you can be yourself, and you're going to encounter people that don't like you soon as you show up. And I don't have to tell you that, but once they get to know you, once they get to know you, they see that you're a real person and that you may have something to teach them. And I think that what I see in it is that there are people who want to get closer to African Americans. And then you can see a lot of people talking about Black Lives Matter, because to watch a man get killed on the TV, Rodney King was an inch from his life from dying. And then to see a man get killed on TV by somebody putting their knee on their neck, all countries see that too. And they say, what is America about? So I'm saying, if there ever was a time that we could get closer together to all races, this is it. And I think you're seeing that, but you still have those factions out there that would keep it apart. And then politicians have grasped hold of that and use that as a divisive way to keep people apart, because it's politically stronger, right, for the people in control. So I think that has been an opportunity for people who have a heart for suffering people, and they're asking us, what can we do, and how can we help this thing called Black Lives Matter? Or how can we just be a party to support Black people? And so that's been happening, and that's a good thing.
I always go back to Matthew's gospel, and Jesus declared, upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. The church is, this past year, has dealt, not just the church, the people of the church this past year have dealt with some horrific things. At a Black Lives Matter protest in Oxnard, they asked us to kneel for the amount of time that that man's knee was on that neck. Now, I must confess I'm starting to age a little bit, but it's insane to think that you would put your knee on somebody's neck for that long. It's insane that even last night, in the midst of 3,000 to 4,000 people dying a day from COVID, people refuse to wear masks. They refuse to social distance. It's a shame that the same group of people who protest in July were considered mobsters, and then people repeat that behavior. I don't want to say repeat. They go out and protest, and they do things like insurgency, like attack the U.S. Capitol, and then try to say that they're the same. They had such disdain for the Black Lives Matter protest in July, but now they're trying to say, oh, we just did the same thing. No, you did not do the same thing. So as you look at all of these kinds of things, the churches have to deal with this forever. So does it change the church? Absolutely not. It certainly affects the people of the church. You cannot be human and not see somebody die on TV and not have it affect you. You cannot be human and see, certainly can't be an American and see what happened on the 6th and not have it disturb you. I mean, we don't even know what's planned for the inauguration. And so the constant thing, that's why I went back to the scripture from the gospel according to Matthew. Upon this rock, and this rock is Christ, I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail. We are not going to be moved as a church. It's certainly going to affect us because we are indeed human. But the bedrock of our faith teaches us that after the rain, the sun will shine again. We're going to get through this pandemic. It's not going to be as fast as we wanted. I wanted it over. In fact, I was sharing with a friend of mine yesterday. I hadn't seen him for a while, and I said, you remember back in early March when we were talking about this will be over in a month or two. It's almost a year later. And the other thing that always grabs my attention is we're so fixated in the United States about the 300,000 people, but worldwide, we're approaching 2 million people that have died from COVID. It just puts it more into perspective in my mind that when I hear people say it's a fake, these are the things that the church has to continue to work on. Informing our people, encouraging our people that though we're going down in the valley of the shadow of despair, his rod and his staff is still with us. His rod and his staff comfort us, and we will come to the other side. It may not be when we think so, but in God's own time, we'll get through all of this. We'll get through this insidious, and I can't hardly watch the news now because a person sat there walking away with a lectern from the U.S. Congress, Speaker of the House in his hand, and he's painted as, well, that's not the person you said, but Maya Angelou said, if somebody show you who they are, believe them.
Right.
If I'm in 7-Eleven walking out in the middle of a riot and I'm walking out with a case of soda, And people come back and say, oh, that's not who he is. Well, yes, in fact, at that moment, that is who I am.
Understood.
So change happens and the church remains the same. The churches have to learn how to deal with situations as they change, and we have.
My plan I laid out for the congregation is we don't know how long we're going to be in this COVID situation, and we want to get back into the church a few people at a time. So we, from my understanding, we got a room to have people spread out, but not right now, because right now we need to stay at home. It's crucially dangerous out there. The virus is in places you don't know where it is. So I'm not trying to get them back in. So what, Brother Darrell, what I want to do is I want to get everybody on. Um, I hate to use one particular thing, but on right now, Zoom is practical enough where we can all be on it. And I want to get the seniors on it. Well, we did it at Parks Chapel. Sometimes we had to go from house to house to get them on there. And then it would take me about somewhere between 40 minutes to an hour just for people to be frustrated enough to stop. And then I'd have to pick it up the next day with them to just get them to a Sunday school meeting. But once everybody gets up there, it's pretty easy.
And then, like all things happen, people leave. So the students started leaving, and so you find that at St. Paul and a lot of the Black churches, you're going to find more of an elderly presence there now.
Right.
Like, yeah, I know you call Elder Margaret Young. I remember Margaret very well. So even when Wendy shared with me that she was the YPD at Young People, she
Yeah.
was the YPD at St. Paul now, because the people that are left there, they're in their 80s and 90s. So it seems like all of the younger people have passed, have moved on. I don't know if they are just not going to church anymore, not connected to the community. I don't know what's happened since I left. But even before I left, it was beginning to decline. But I had two daughters, and they were active in the church, and they bring their friends. They bring even some of their white friends that they went to school with. But it wasn't a large population like it was during the Ron Wright days.
Gotcha.
And I just want to mention that before Reverend Clark came, um, Reverend Reuben Ford was the pastor, and he became the pastor after Ron Wright. And when he left, um, he went to Santa Monica, and I joined his church in Santa Monica, and I still am a member of that church, even though he's at another church now. So he was the one who succeeded Reverend Ron Wright, and then Reverend Clark came.
Get everybody on social media. If you want the young people, like Sister Young is saying, you have to get them through social media. God can play through social media, meaning you can send the message that people are going to their TV to get sermons now. So what I'm saying is that we need to be on Facebook, Twitter, but we need to have a gospel message, not the secular message. So we're doing that. We did it in Parks Chapel. We're gonna go after the young people because we're gonna bring the message of Christ in a dying world, and we want people to be saved.
Conversations that I've had with some of the younger people in Santa Barbara, maybe a couple of elders here or there, is like one of the issues, not just for Black Santa Barbans, but Santa Barbans in general, you know, Hispanic, Latinx. I mean, just like a lack of overall job opportunities, um, because there doesn't seem to be as much of an economic base that is diverse enough for a wide group of people. There are a lot of folks who come here, they go to college, and then they go back home to go to work,
Mhm.
or if they live in the area, they go on to other parts of the world, or if they have jobs here, they commute in and leave. I don't know if that has anything to do with the dynamic or um, You know, if that's anything
That's
that
that's
you,
a true statement. That's a true statement. After I had my two daughters, I mean, in order to be able to, for me and my husband to put them through college, you know, I actually worked two jobs. I mean, at the same time I was a full-time high school counselor at San Marcos High School. I was also a part-time counselor at Santa Barbara City College. I mean, I was doing both things to just get them through college. And it's like you're right. Most of the time after people graduate, they don't stay. They leave. And you know, they have this saying. I don't know if Sally ever told you this, but they have this saying about Santa Barbara that is for newlyweds and nearly deads. Okay,
hey,
and that if you're in the middle, you know, it's hard.
it seems like much of your sense of community really emanates from your experiences with the church.
It
Would that be
started that
this?
way, and then my active involvement in like the George Washington Carver Scholarship Club, which I was, you know, the president of it, which still originated from the church. Uh, that opened up more doors to be able to be connected to the community, and of course, as I started working at Santa Barbara City College, I became more active in community by being on different panels and stuff just to provide diversity. Uh, Working on committees like Martin Luther King Day committee, or whenever they had any kind of activity going on, usually during Black History Month, but not necessarily, but at the Cabrillo Arts Center where they had a panel of people to discuss or they wanted educators to participate. I tried to participate in things that way. Um, Santa Barbara is a beautiful place, Santa Barbara and Toledo, and I don't regret staying and having my daughters there. I think I prefer to have raised them in Santa Barbara as opposed to, you know, where I lived in Los Angeles. But um, when I left Santa Barbara, it was time to leave. It was just, you know, we could never afford to buy a home there. It was just time.
The interesting thing is I look at this and Santa Barbara is not unique in this aspect as all of the churches worldwide are going to try to figure out how do we recover from COVID. Folk are getting comfortable at church in the living room. Don't have to get dressed, don't have to do my hair, don't have to put on no suit, I don't have to brave traffic. I can do a worship service and then go right into whatever else I'm doing. So when I think about what's there for the church, we have to be prepared now to start repopulating because I'm absolutely convinced we're going to come out of this pandemic. But what are we going to come out as? Um, we have to really start thinking about that. So some of the things that COVID is really going to make us do is, as Pastor Sherrod was saying, we are not going to be able to get rid of this virtual aspect of worship because some people will remain comfortable where they are. There are lots of people chomping at the bit to get back into the in-face, person-to-person uh, worship because part of that is fellowship. We as human beings have a need and a deep need to be around people. That's why we're having such a hard time with this pandemic because there's something innate within us that wants to fellowship. And one of the things we do, and one of the former members of St. Paul that's gone home to glory, Brother Freddie Walker would tell you in a heartbeat, we don't shake hands here at St. Paul, we hug. And, you know, those are some of the things that we have to take into consideration. How are we going to, you know, how are we going to do that? So as the church is planning for this, I wouldn't say change, Mr. McNeill. I would say we have to focus our attention on how are we going to reconstruct the worship service. It's going to be pretty close to a calendar year. Well, it's going to be well past the calendar year because it's going to be probably late this summer or early fall before we are actually able to get back to something. And so the idea is, how do we continue to do this? To use a fishing analogy, we got the perfect lure.
Right.
It's the word of God. That's the only thing we have. It's the word of God. We have to make sure that we package it. Whether you do it virtually, whether you try to do it hip hop style, whether you do it the old hymns, it always is going to come back to the word of God. You know, we say in the secular world, the only thing that's constant is change. But in the church, the only thing that is constant is the word of God. So as we figure out how we manipulate and reconstruct after COVID, what still is going to remain is the word of God.
Yes, well said.
You know, one of the things that I certainly wanted to make sure that we acknowledge in this, you know, the designation we got was the landmark designation, which speaks to the Gothic style construction of the building. It also talks about the mural that hangs in the nave of the church, which was you know, painted and donated by an internationally known artist, Lilia Tuckerman. That's just the aesthetics. But I think what we have tried to convey to you over this call is that the historic input of the members of St. Paul are equally impressive. That since December of 1903, 117 plus years now, which has been a bedrock for the African American community in Santa Barbara. Those are the kinds of things that, as I said, not a science major, not a history major, but as I began to take on that project with the help of significant amount of people, the history became important, and I saw what the members of St. Paul have done in the community, and I certainly am impressed by what they have done and what they will do. You know, you consider now that the congregation size of the church is very small, but still prominent.
I've been in contact with people periodically because there's been these discussions about St. Paul becoming a landmark. We had these discussions before I even left because there's a lot of rich history in that church. And so I was really happy to hear that finally it became a landmark.
Of what are you the most proud in terms of your involvement with the church?
Hey, Reverend Clark, you want to go first or second? I'll let you decide. I'd rather you end the thing. I'd rather your voice be the last as heard.
He
If
said,
this is the last
he
question,
said you're
so
gonna
let
let
me
me
go
decide,
and
but
say,
you already
yeah.
decided. I like the way
Well,
you
go ahead
did
and
that.
decide. Go ahead and
No,
decide. I'll let
no,
you
I want you to
decide.
go
No,
first
you
now.
decide.
Now I want you to go first now.
Okay, so I'll be quick and I'll be short. But I would say is like this. There's a thought. The Sankofa bird is the bird that has his head under looking back and looking forth at the same time. So I've heard a great manager say, if you want to be on the right perspective, have 1 foot in the past and 1 foot in the future. And so I would say that the greatest thing about my ministry, and I've only started at St. Paul, but my ministry as a minister and even as a layperson has been 2 things. God, of course, Christ is my joy, and he moves me to stay up late at night, to do all I need to do, to work hard and still have energy. But the joy of my ministry has been 2 sets of people, and that is the young people who have saved me, and the old people, and I say old, I mean the seniors. And my ministry has been with them. I brought centurions to church. There was a 106-year-old lady, Sister Wynn. She was called the oldest Laker fan there was. I used to take her to church, pick her up and take her to church. And then I had a 102-year-old lady. I had to sometimes pick her up and put her in the car. And then not just them, but my ministry to seniors has been great. I didn't talk as much like I'm talking like with you guys around them. I listened to them. And then children have saved me when my daughter was in church, and I had them in church. And when I worked with the children in the YPD, I put on plays, I put on speech contests, I coach basketball, soccer, I coach track. I just want to be around young people, because if they remember you in those tender ages and you're talking about God, then they'll remember God, and they remember who told them about God. And so plays, I put them in plays. I do all I can for the young people and the seniors. I love them, and that's been the strength of my ministry, that I learned from both of them. So they're giving me more than I'm getting from them. Reverend Clark, you've been great to me. Go ahead.
I see what you wanted to go first for. You wanted to set the bar so high that I could just stumble under it.
No, there's never high for you.
When I think about ministry, the thing, and I'll use the word proud because that's how you cast it. Just integrity in ministry. What I mean by that is treating people right. I know that's kind of odd to say from a church perspective, but there's a significant need to respect and treat people right. It was told to me a long time ago in my ministry, if you treat people right, they'll help you learn how to pastor them. Mm-hmm. And it has been the best advice that I ever got. If your mindset is to, when I think about my parents, I think I won't say perfect, but I'm certainly a combination of their two personalities. My father was that wasn't a bit of work that he was afraid to do. He worked hard his entire life, and my mother had a compassionate spirit, and so I tried to pour those two aspects into service: work hard and be compassionate about the people. Obviously, you got to be compassionate about the Word of God as well, but just those two aspects is probably what I'm. When I reflect back over it, I want people to know that, you can trust that if I tell you I'm going to do something, I'm going to do it. If I tell you I'm not going to do it, I'm not going to do it. So that's that integrity thing. Roll up your sleeves and do whatever you have to do. As most of the charges I've had have been small congregations. Roll up your sleeves, do the work, treat people right, and that's something sincerely to be proud of, is that you fostered. It would not be right for me to speak in this vein without talking about my mentor in the ministry, who embodied those characteristics, the late Reverend Dr. Johnny Carlisle Jr., who was a man of supreme integrity, brilliant mind, but as compassionate a man as you could ever run into. He certainly indelibly marked my service to it, and that's the thing that I'm proud of, that I can look back over and say that I've treated people right, and I've worked hard to build relationships.